Hi, I'm Julie Yaki. The following webinar will introduce you to the practice of project management and the tools and techniques that project managers and project teams use to deliver both small and really complex projects. Throughout the discussion, we'll point out how you can make use of these tools and techniques to achieve both work and personal objectives. I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Everybody, welcome today to our US WIN webinar, Project Management, the Art and Science of Getting Things Done. There are several ways to participate in today's webinar. Please use the chat feature for ongoing and engaging conversation. Raise your hand if you have a question, and you will be asked to come off mute when the time is appropriate. Please put questions into the Q&A if you don't want to come off mute to ask your question verbally. Also in the Q&A, you can upvote questions to increase their interest. Questions, both verbal and Q&A, will be addressed at the end of the presentation or at specific points during the presentation. Also, please be aware that we are recording today's session for inclusion in the US WIN library. Now on to our webinar. Today, we are pleased to welcome presenters Julie Yaki and Christine Darling. Julie is a PM with over 23 years experience in nuclear industry project management at Constellation. Christine is a project lead focusing on continuous improvement at Energy Northwest. Julie?
Great, thanks, Emily. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Julie Yaki, and I also want to welcome you to our presentation on project management. I'm really happy to see so many of you here. We tried to put together a presentation that will give you some insight into how project managers work, and also to give you some takeaways that you can use in your job or on projects outside of work. So let's jump in and take a quick look at our agenda. All right, so we'll start by talking a little bit about project management's history. Then we'll define what projects are and how they come about, and what are the most important skills that you need to have to be a good project manager. Then we'll look at the project lifecycle and some of the tools and techniques that project teams use. But before we do that, we'd love to get to know our audience. So let's do a quick poll. Over to you, Christine.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks for outlining what we will be covering today. As Julie said, before we get started, we like to know what brings you to this webinar. So Caitlin, can you put up the poll for us? And please pick one of the situations that most closely describe you. Your options are as follows. I am not a project manager, but I may be interested in becoming one. I'm not a project manager by title, but I manage projects at work and home often. I don't know much about project management. I'm here to learn, or I'm a project management or in the project management field. Okay, Emily, can we see? We'll give a few more seconds here because we do have several people. Let us know what we're seeing in the polls. So far, it's very interesting. I'm seeing a different side, and we have a lot of people that aren't project managers, but they manage projects at work and home. So let's go ahead and stop this poll and share the results. As you can see, as I mentioned, we have a lot of people that aren't project managers, but they manage projects in the work and the home often. What I also like is that we have 17% of those attending that don't know much about project management, and so they're here to learn. So it's going to be amazing today to hear all of these things that you're going to learn about. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about today is how we can do projects that aren't related to work, but we can still use the project management fundamentals. Now that we're all a little more acquainted, Julie is going to give us an introduction to what project management is and how developed over time. Back to you, Julie.
Great. Thanks, Christine. Let me advance the slide here. Okay, so what is project management? It's the practice of leading a team that will follow and execute a detailed plan within a specific time to accomplish a specific goal. So if this sounds familiar, it's because it describes a lot of things that we do, regardless if we're project managers or not. when we're planning vacations or home projects or things like trying to get our kids into college. Those are basically all projects. And as we do those things, we're trying to balance the different people, their needs and wants with a fixed amount of money and time. So it's what project managers do, and it's not always easy. So we rely on certain tools and techniques that have been proven to work over a long period of time. And so we'll be talking about those throughout this presentation. So before we get started, let's take a quick look at some of the earliest projects in history. So people have actually been managing projects for almost 5,000 years. The pharaohs built the Great Pyramids of Giza in 2570 BC, and this is probably one of the earliest examples of organized project work. So what did the pharaohs have to accomplish this project? Well, they had thousands of slaves, and they moved about 2 million stone cubes that each weighed about 2.5 tons. So they did that without any of the engineering and the machines that we have today. In fact, even with all of our scientific advances and our fancy machines, we're not really sure how they managed to move those stones and place them so precisely. Once in a while, I'll tune into shows on the History Channel, and they'll try to convince you that they had help from ancient aliens. And whether you believe that or not, it's a lot more likely that they were just really, really good at planning and coordination. Another similar example from about 2,300 years ago was the construction of the Great Wall of China, another wonder, of the world, considering the level of technology that was available at the time. I think both the pyramids and the Great Wall will probably be standing far longer than some of the things that we're building today. So while there have been lots of organized work done throughout history, it was really in the 20th century that project management became a recognized profession with established tools and processes. It all started in the early part of the century because World War I needed new technology for warfare, and then World War II later on. And they needed entire industries that kind of sprung to life to support that war effort. This brought a lot of innovation to create advantages for the nations that were at war so they can win. And all those projects needed to be run in an organized way. So people really started to think about how to do all that. Some sources consider the father of modern project management to be a French mining engineer by the name of Henri Fayol, who wrote a book called Principles of Management back in 1916. He stressed in his book that it was more important for a project manager to have strong leadership skills than it was to have the technical skills and in the sciences and the crafts that were needed to do the project work. And this is still how we really see the role of project managers today. So as all the wars went on, and at the same time society continued to grow, there were more needs for bigger and bigger projects for infrastructure and innovation. And the people doing these projects needed better tools to coordinate everything to stay on track. So they continued to come up with these tools and passing them on to others in the profession. Again, we'll talk about a couple of those tools, like the Gantt chart, which is essentially a graphical representation of the tasks and the work processes in a project schedule. An American mechanical engineer called Henry Gantt came up with this in 1923, and the tool was then used in some huge projects in the 1930s and the 40s, like the Hoover Dam construction, the construction of the interstate highway system, and the Manhattan Project, which was to build the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project was a perfect example of a project that needed really effective tools to coordinate all the work. It was only a 3-year project between 1942 and 45, but it cost over $2 billion and involved around 130,000 people from various different backgrounds, from scientists to construction workers. Then Between the 1950s and 70s, other huge projects followed and developed even more tools and techniques to work more efficiently. For example, the DuPont company developed the critical path method of scheduling for the building of their chemical plant, and we'll touch on that later as well. Other projects of note were like the Polaris missile project by the Navy in the 50s and the 60s, and then NASA's Apollo program that led to the exploration of the moon. So by 1960, people were managing huge projects everywhere. And so the Project Management Institute was established to sort of document all the tools and then help improve them. In 1987, PMI published the PMBOK, the Project Management Book of Knowledge. There's a picture of the book there in the slide, which really became the gold standard for project management. And that's what we still use today. PMI is the organization that certifies project managers based on their knowledge and practice to use these principles that are laid out in the PMBOK. So if after this presentation you're interested in learning more about project management, you can check out their website. It's at pmi.org, as well as projectmanagement.com that also has a ton of learning resources. Of course, we all know that tools, controls, and processes are only as good as the teams that use them. So not all major projects end up in success, and I'll be talking about a couple of those as well. So before we get into all that detail, let me establish what is a project. A project is a temporary undertaking with a unique result. This result is based on a very specific set of requirements that need to be fulfilled within a specific time frame with a specific amount of money. The outcome of a project can be a product, a service, an event, or something else that someone needs. A project is something that usually happens only once, and it creates something new or makes something better, as opposed to programs and processes that are more regularly repeated, like a cyclical maintenance of a system or the general day-to-day work of employees in a company. So how does a project come about? I love this definition that I heard in a LinkedIn presentation. A project generally gets started when someone has a problem to solve or an opportunity to pursue. The most important aspect of any project is that it delivers value to the customer. And the customer can be a person, an organization, a government, or a cause. And we'll also go through how we can determine the best way to produce that value. So let me again turn over to Christine for some of her perspective on project works.
Thanks, Julie. As I mentioned, my hope for today is to give you some ideas on how we can use project management techniques in our own personal lives. So today I'm going to be sharing with you some of the ways that I use the techniques in a couple areas of my life. I was actually quite surprised to realize that even the simple things can be managed like projects. Simple personal projects can range from buying a new appliance, a car, to home repairs and improvements, trips, or even organizing events like vacations. While those may not be very complex, they are very unique events that you don't regularly do. I don't think I buy appliances every day. One of the larger, more complex projects that I have worked on personally is acting as a wedding coordinator for friends' weddings. I use most, if not all, of the techniques that Julie is talking about today to help me accomplish a great event for the couple. Now that we've defined what projects are, most of you have probably realized that you do them all the time. So let's take a moment to find out what types of projects you manage and what was the single biggest challenge you ran into. Can you put a few words into the chat, and Emily can provide us and pick a few examples for us to talk about? So Emily, I'm going to turn it over to you to see what's in the chat.
Hey everybody, it looks like we've got quite a few coming in the chat. Event planning, a siren upgrade project. And I love this one. When members doing any of their webinars or event planning, right? Scheduling family vacations, destination weddings, family reunions, college selection for my kids. That's interesting. I wonder how that works. Facilities maintenance and coordinate manage projects, large orders, medical mobility company, 50th birthday, a Lego castle. Yeah, it looks like there's quite a array of people using project management skills in a lot of different things. I love it. Christine, you're on mute.
Thank you. That's just amazing and some awesome examples as I'm still reading some of the chat. It's a great way and a great example of the variety of items that can be projects. And well, we have a lot of unofficial project managers here today, so that's even more awesome. But we're going to dive even deeper. So, Julie, we're going to send it back to you to talk about what attributes are most important to be an effective professional project manager. I'm sure you'll all recognize some of these in yourselves.
Yeah, it seems like we have a lot of project managers here today, whether that's their job description or not. So let's talk a little bit about the project manager, who's generally the most visible part of the project. It's the project manager's job to put together a team that has all the right technical folks and the skilled workers to plan and execute the work. According to PMI's talent triangle, there are 3 major attributes that project managers need to have. So on the left side here, we got technical project management skills, which means the ability to use the project management tools and techniques to get the project from the initial idea to the final product. Then on the right-hand side, we have leadership skills, and we had touched on this before. Good project managers should be able to convey the vision of the project to their team and then inspire and motivate them to do their best work. And then thirdly, at the bottom, PMs need to be able to understand the strategic purpose behind their projects and how it delivers value and how that value fits into the larger strategic purpose of the customer. In other words, you need to be able to understand what your stakeholders need and why, so that you can bring them the right rock, essentially. And this is where some of these tools that we're talking about today are going to help. So let me move on to our next slide and talk a little bit about the project life cycle. But before we actually do that, let me talk a little bit about the difference between the 2 project management methods that you are most likely to hear of and see at work. These are the Agile and the Waterfall methods of project management. We'll be talking about the Waterfall method all throughout this presentation, but let me also define the Agile method and how the 2 are different. The Agile method is more commonly used in technology and product development projects that need a sort of iterative, creative approach, because you're most likely creating something new that needs to be better than the other things, similar things on the market today. So as you go through the design process, you're constantly coming up with ideas, and then you test those ideas and then make sure that they're working. And if they're not working, then you make changes based on the test results. And you continuously go through this process as you're fleshing out that final product. You need to be flexible and nimble because you're also trying to deliver the project quickly so you can beat competitors to the market. So that's not the case in a waterfall method. Waterfall is a more linear approach that minimizes change. It's the process that we use in our industry for modifications and construction because we usually work to some very well-defined spec and need to deliver exactly that. So these are generally longer term projects with set timelines, and just like building a house from the ground up, each of the phases build upon the one before. And the success of each phase greatly depends on the quality of the work that's done in the previous phase. And so all of this has to be planned out in really great detail up front. It's kind of a measure twice, cut once approach. So in the traditional waterfall project lifecycle, the project is accomplished in the 5 phases that are listed on the slide, and I'll talk about each of these. So these are your project initiation, project planning, execution, monitor and control, and then the project closure. Before I get started with project initiation, let me talk a little bit about a pretty well-known large-scale project that I'll be using as an example throughout the presentation. Most of you probably remember the Athens Olympics in 2004. They had beautiful opening ceremonies, and they had really nice facilities for the competition, and everything looked great. Well, what the world didn't see was the string of bad decisions and failures that kind of plagued the project from the beginning, and then left a really negative impact on the country after the Olympics Games. The project team had 7 years to plan and finish everything, but they wasted more than half of that with changing plans and staffing shakeups and all sorts of setbacks. Their decision-making was constantly derailed by politics and different stakeholders wanting different things, constantly pressuring the team to make changes. They ended up pulling things together in the last 3 months before the opening of the games, with a last-minute change in project manager. So after it was all said and done, the Olympics cost 8.5 billion euros, and it left Greece with significant debt. The project also left behind lots of unused infrastructure in the form of these unique, expensive buildings that couldn't be used for anything else. So they were kind of left to fall into disrepair after the games, as you can see on the slide here. Most of them were later demolished, or they had to be completely rebuilt for other purposes, and that obviously cost Greece even more money. So it's a bit of, throwing good money after bad kind of situation. So how do we not end up with a project like that? Let's start at the beginning. So now we can move into initiation. Project initiation is the first stage in the waterfall lifecycle. A number of questions need to be answered during this phase. First of all, what specifically does the project need to accomplish, and what are we looking to gain by doing it? Also, what are some of the alternate ways to get the outcome that we want, and which of those will get us the most benefit at the lowest cost and risk? The business case looks at the alternatives to help us choose the right approach and then kind of rationalize our investment. This is clearly something that the Athens Olympics project team should have done a better job with, so they could sort of future-proof their investment instead of creating a burden. You use this business case approach in your personal life as well. For example, when you're thinking through whether you want to replace a broken car or an appliance or get it repaired, and you're taking into consideration the cost, the urgency, the convenience of either solution. So that's essentially a business case. Another consideration that before starting work on any project is whether it's feasible to do it and what is the chance of success. This is where a feasibility study comes in. Think of it this way. If your gas line is broken behind your stove, you can probably fix it for less than you would pay a contractor to do it. But what are the chances that you get it done right and not blow up the house? If you have a 50-50 chance of getting it right, is that enough? I would say it's a hard no for me on doing it ourselves. And that's essentially what a feasibility study will help you figure out. So once your business case and your feasibility study helped answer the question of, should we do this project and can we do this project? There's still a bunch of other details that you need to work out before someone will commit, serious amounts of money to your project. So those additional details will go into your project charter, which we'll delve into next. But first, I'd like to take another quick poll. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat and Emily can let me know. So I'm going to send it back to you, Christine.
Perfect. So we would love to see if some of you would be willing to raise your hands, and Emily can take you off of mute, and give us an example of when you used a business case or a feasibility study to make an important personal decision. Or you can enter it into the chat and Emily can give us a couple of examples. So Emily, I'm going to turn it over to you for a few minutes.
Great, thanks, Christine. We actually do have a question that's not related to feasibility. It was actually back on the waterfall slide. Her question is, isn't execution and monitoring/control in parallel? She wouldn't really consider those in series like a waterfall. Julie, what do you say?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. They do happen in parallel. So in other words, the list gives you kind of the pieces of the entire project, but that monitoring and controlling does take place at the same time as project execution. It's a great question.
Thank you. Does anybody have anything to share on a business case or feasibility study? Oh, Emily Watson. Please come off mute.
Hello.
Hi, Emily.
We are currently doing this with our family. We're in the planning stages of doing a remodel on our home in different stages. So in order to do the floor, we need to move kitchen cabinets. In order to move kitchen cabinets, we need to do these things. So we are measuring the pros and cons and what comes first and so on and so forth. So we're definitely creating business case and doing feasibility studies to get that job done.
Thank you, Emily. It's a great point.
Yeah, that's a great example.
All right, Matthew, your turn. Go ahead and come off mute.
Yeah, hi.
Oh, you went back on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
All right. So out here at the Palo Verde Generating Station, feasibility studies are important to us, especially when we don't know exactly what the project deliverable is. For example, on one of our normal chiller replacement projects, there were multiple options to replace the normal chillers like for like in place, move them to a location, go to a modular chiller plant. So a feasibility study was very important to us to determine what was the best path forward for the station before we completed our business case and moved forward with the project.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you,
a
Matthew.
perfect example. Yeah, thank you for that.
All right, in the chat, I'm seeing a roof replacement. Had to consider the worth, the risk, waiting another year or two. Ultimately, the weather decided for them, it looks like. In most business case, feasibility study is, should I buy a house? Business case, you're having your own place to live. Feasibility, do I have the savings, the fund? Can I make it possible? Can I live out the spur of the moment decision, pass out that decision a little bit longer instead of making that decision right now. Another chat says, deciding to move to a new state or city and buy a house there. And it looks like that is all. Let me check for hands. All right, Julie, back to you.
Those were great examples. And if you've never used a business case or a feasibility study and you feel like your situation is calling for one, check out the internet. As you all know, you can get anything and everything answered on the internet, and there's simple models and things like that. So just do a Google search and you can find a lot of good information. Okay, let's move on to our next discussion. So I talked about the project charter and its importance. So let's talk about a little bit more of the detail that goes into the charter. So creating a project charter is an important part of the initiation phase because it really sets up the project for detailed planning. You'll do a number of things to develop a charter. First, you need to do a thorough stakeholder analysis because you need to know all the people and organizations and interests that are impacted by or involved with your project. Those are all folks that are stakeholders. Why is this important? Because you will need to build relationships with them to know what they need and what they're bringing to the table, and also to get their cooperation to get the project done. Your most important stakeholder is your customer, generally called your project sponsor, who's providing your project objectives. This all gets documented in your charter. Additionally, your charter will establish your authority to lead the project team and to assign them work. Why is this important? Especially in our industry, I think you'll find this situation. If you're managing a project in a matrix organization, the people on your project team don't normally report to you. They report to functional area managers and they have other work to do. But when they're working on your project, you're effectively their boss, and the charter formalizes that temporary relationship. Your project scope statement is again based on the objectives that your sponsor provides. Your scope needs to be very specific and spell out exactly what will be done and most likely what will not be done as part of the project. When details aren't predetermined, they leave room for interpretation. So that can lead to the project team being pressured by various stakeholders to make changes. And even small changes will cost money, but also add more work, and all of that can delay your project. So once your charter is approved by your sponsor, you can then finally move into project planning. And let me actually, Christine, before we do that, do you want to add some additional personal perspective here on some of the projects that you work on?
I sure would, Julie. So a couple of months ago, I started planning a family vacation. It would be the first with my significant other and his family, as two of his kids had upcoming birthdays the same weekend, and we wanted to celebrate both of them during a long weekend trip. So we all got together. We wanted to make sure we were going to have a good time, which became our project objective, was to make sure their birthdays were celebrated and they had fun. So our initiation of our project was we talked to the main stakeholders, and in this case, it was the two kids that had birthdays, to find out, hey, what would you like to do? What would they like? Where would they like to go? We all got together. We brainstormed some ideas of how to celebrate both of their birthdays while making each of them feel unique. And so we planned some fun activities along the trip for both of them. And that became our project scope, which then became and made us have our budget that we were willing to spend. And so, with all of that decided, we were ready to move forward to the planning stage, which Julie's going to talk about shortly. As I mentioned earlier, I also helped a plan a wedding for some friends. And that engaged couple were my sponsors. They were my main stakeholders. But the stakeholders list also included all of the guests in this instance. My project team was all of the suppliers, the florist, the caterers, the vendor that printed the invitations, the people that worked at the venue. My sponsors, the young couple, provided a very detailed scope of exactly how they wanted everything to happen and entrusted me to plan everything out in detail. I'll be talking a little bit more about this later. Back to you, Julie. Julie, you're on mute.
Julie, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thanks, Christine. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, tools and controls are only as good as the willingness and the ability of teams to use them and to stick to the plan. Otherwise, things can go off rails pretty quickly and you can have some potentially disastrous results. The Challenger Space Shuttle project in the early 1980s was a really sad example of this. Some of you might have lived through it as children, and you probably remember all the excitement that surrounded this. NASA was sending for the first time a civilian into space along with 6 other astronauts. Her name was Krista McAuliffe, and in this picture, she's the lady in the upper row, the second from the left. She was an elementary school teacher, and she was selected from thousands, probably tens of thousands of people to be the first teacher in space. And she was actually going to teach some lessons during the mission. Unfortunately, she never had the chance to do that because NASA tragically lost the shuttle on liftoff on January 28, 1986. This disaster played out on our TV screens live. Kids were sitting in schoolrooms watching this. It was a pretty stressful time. And in the aftermath, of course, the attention turned to everyone that was involved with the project. And people were demanding answers for how something like this could ever happen. So what happened? The Challenger accident was caused by a design flaw in the spacecraft's O-rings. And I have a picture showing the O-rings here on the slide. These are mechanical gaskets that are designed to create a seal between 2 surfaces. Well, the ones on the Challenger had a design flaw that made them very susceptible to extreme cold. And the morning of the launch was much, much colder than anyone expected. You could see some of the pictures here with the ice, sort of icicles hanging off the equipment. And this extreme cold caused that primary O-ring to become extremely brittle, so it wouldn't seal properly. This then caused structural failure when the pressurized burning gas from the rocket motor reached the external fuel tank, which then disintegrated and the Challenger was ripped apart. A lot of lessons came out of this tragedy. For the project management community, the event focused the conversation on things like group dynamics, risk management, and quality management, and communication, which were found to be some of the major root causes of the disaster. First, they accepted a really serious design flaw that put the shuttle at risk. They also had sort of a really bad group dynamic for decision making because even after the engineers tried to communicate the design flaw, mission leadership still sort of caved into the pressure from NASA to launch the shuttle in those bad weather conditions. So we know what happened. So we'll be talking a little bit more about this particular example as we go through some of the discussion. Okay, so let's get started with project planning. Project planning creates the playbook, essentially, for implementing and controlling the project. The documents that are listed here are really important because developing these documents drives the project team to go through a rigorous thinking and challenge process that's absolutely needed to put together a solid plan. So let's take a quick look at these. The first 2 on the list, the risk and quality management plans, are extremely important, as we can clearly see in the Challenger example. The purpose of a strong risk management plan is that the project team can identify problems that can come up during execution ahead of time and decide how will they deal with them when they happen. And you want to do this during planning because there's more time to think through how you would respond to a problem like that than there is when you're already in the moment and you're dealing with that stress. How will you respond if there's an unexpected change in weather or some other disruption? What will you do if an important piece of equipment doesn't show up on time? You want to have those plans to go to, and so you can kind of set up contingencies and plan how you'll escalate the decision making and how you deal with these situations. For the Challenger project, clearly the right decision would have been to delay the launch when they saw all that ice. Unfortunately, that's not what they did. Another important document is your quality plan. You need to document the standards that you need to meet. Have a plan to address what you do if you find that you're deviating from that standard and what needs to happen before you can move forward. Well before the launch, when the Challenger engineers alerted the project teams that the O-rings could fail, they could have stopped and redesigned them instead of ignoring the issue. I actually read that one of the engineers later told his wife that NASA had their mindset on going up and proving to the world that they were right and that they knew what they were doing, but they didn't. Investigation also pointed to communication failures as a contributing factor in the disaster. And this further underscores the fact that the success of any project depends on effective communication. Your communication plan ensures that the right people get the right information at the right time so they can make decisions and act on that information. Project management is all about coordination. If your left hand doesn't know what your right hand is doing, there's chaos. Then your resource management plan lays out who works on what, which includes where the important decisions are made. And your financial management plan has your detailed cost estimates so you can track your spending against the plan. And then you have a procurement plan that lays out how you select the contractors and the vendors that are providing your materials and doing some or all of the work. You work through all of these details ahead of time so you can look back later and kind of understand how you ended up with one contractor versus the other and what was the decision-making process that went into that. So as I said before, every project, no matter how well planned, runs into problems and changes are sometimes necessary. But it's very important to control the amount of change, not only because change usually costs more, but it can also increase your risks and it can affect your quality. So project teams need to have a predetermined set of conditions and a decision-making process for dealing with those changes. And this is what becomes your change management plan. And then last of your project plan documents is your time management plan, which is your schedule. And I'll talk about that in more detail. So Christine, how do you use your project plans?
Well, every project personally is a little bit different in its setup and documents. So let's start with the family vacation. I needed a simple risk plan, like what are we going to do if there's an emergency, the weather, or anything like that. We also needed to have a financial plan, which was our budget. How much are we going to spend for all the activities, including the lodging, the food, and things like that? And then, of course, we needed a communication plan to lay out who should be notified about our trip, how we're going to get help with where we're staying if we need help, or if something happens with the house, who's going to take care of that while we're gone. It goes as easy as simple as, do you need the post office to hold your mail? Do you need somebody to check on your house? Obviously, you need a schedule to coordinate your travel and entertainment during the trip. So, in my trip, we had 5 adults and 1 child, 5 different schedules. We needed to make sure we were maximizing our time, but also in line with everybody's schedule of when they could travel and things like that. But we also knew that there were going to be simpler documents as well. because it was a small project. But you may find that your projects for medium size is going to be a little bit different than your larger size projects, or even complex projects. For me, how I equate of a vacation versus building a house, totally different size projects, and you're going to need totally different size documents in their setup. So the other example I'm talking about is planning the wedding. I'm using the same tools that Julie has been talking about. And for one wedding, I literally had like 3 weeks of when I was handed the wedding to when the day of the wedding was happening. And I had to dive into my project management skills to make sure that I was within the time constraint of what I needed done, used all of those documents to make sure I was staying on track. And my project document turned into a very big binder that had multiple tabs. But the one that I used most was my communication plans and my change management plans. As Julie said, when planning anything, you need to make sure you communicate clearly and have contingencies and backup plans for when things do change. And I'll talk more about those later. I'll hand it back to Julie to take a look at how some of those detail plans are prepared.
Great,
Hey,
thanks.
Christine,
Thanks.
before you jump off, we do have someone in the chat that's actually asking if you have a template for a project charter that you would be able to share. I know that a lot of us have templates, but they're work related, and that's something that we can't, unfortunately, cannot share with the WIN group. But is there something that you've seen that you could share in the chat possibly?
I don't have anything specific with me because that's all on my personal computer at home, but I could look and see if I could grab it, and then I can send it to Emily and we can get it out to everybody.
Perfect. Thank you. And then we
You're
do
welcome.
have a question. Are you okay to take a question right now, Julie?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Heather, would you like to come off mute, please? Well, maybe we have lost her. It looks like we have lost her. So go ahead, Julie.
Okay, I do see a question from Susan asking if a change management plan is how to deal with the outcomes of the risk plan. Yes, that is one of the things that your change management plan will do. You need to be able to have plans for how to deal with changes, and that's essentially what that's doing. So as you set up your risk plan, and you kind of prioritize your risks and establish a list of which ones are the most important. Part of the risk management process is to actually figure out how you'll deal with it. And that's kind of how that process ties in with having a change plan. Does that answer your question, Susan? Okay, great, thank you. All right, so let's get into talking about another. Hang on a second. Oops, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think I've got it. Okay. So project planning. Let's get into some of the tools. So two of the most important questions you'll answer as a project manager is how much the project is going to cost and how long it'll take to do. So creating a work breakdown structure, or a WBS, will help you with both of these. And let me explain kind of how this comes together. So a WBS is essentially a graphical representation of all the work that you need to do. You'll start on your WBS with the larger project objective that's in your scope statement, which lays out the end result that the project has to accomplish. For example, building a house. Then you start breaking down that objective into smaller, more manageable chunks. These can be called deliverables. And then you keep breaking those chunks up into even smaller and smaller pieces until you get down to the lowest level of detail, which will be your individual activities or tasks. So what's that level of detail? Imagine you're building a new house for your family, since we've been kind of using that example throughout. Before you move all your stuff in, what is the last task that you need to do, that needs to be taken care of? I would probably say for me would be like a final cleaning, making sure that everything's spick and span before I bring my stuff in. So that's generally the level of detail that we're talking about in a WBS. Once you have this level of detail in your work breakdown structure, you can then easily figure out the total cost of the project by adding together the cost of each of those individual activities. And then once you add durations to show how long each of these steps will take, then you can get a better idea of how long the entire project will take. And then with that information, you can start developing your project schedule. So your WBS will probably start out on a big yellow notepad or on a bunch of sticky notes on a conference room wall, but it should end up something like this that you see on the slide. One of the things you work out as you go through the WBS is to determine your task dependencies, or the relationship between the tasks in terms of time. The length of your project isn't necessarily the same as the total length of every single individual task. A lot of the work will be done in parallel. So some tasks are dependent on the completion of other tasks. So they have to follow each other in the timeline, but then some tasks have no dependencies with anything else. So once you define that for each of the tasks, your scheduler will enter those dependencies into the scheduling software, and then it will create, the software will create the most effective path through getting everything done on time. So let me actually move on to the project schedule itself. So project schedules can get really, really complicated, especially on long-term projects with hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of activities. The good news is that project teams generally include a dedicated project scheduler who's certified to use a scheduling software, and the software will find the best way to sequence all of the work. So again, schedulers like project managers are certified by PMI, and really every complex project should have one. Once you set your schedule, you'll be reviewing it and statusing the activities on a regular basis, probably at least weekly. Why is it important that you do this? Well, schedule delays are usually the first indicator that a project is going off track. So you really need to pay attention, and you'll be using this information, how far along you are with each task, to monitor your project and monitor some of your financials. And I'll talk about that later. There are also a couple of other tools that I mentioned earlier, and understanding how they're used can really help people plan personal projects like what Christine has been talking about, as well as work assignments. So I mentioned earlier the critical path method of scheduling. Let me talk a little bit about what does that really mean, because I'm sure you're hearing it probably as you're attending meetings or status updates on projects. Critical path activities are normally the highest priority activities in the schedule, because if there's any delay in these activities, it can risk the completion of the project. And you generally can't move forward with the project until these critical activities are completed. Most activities in your schedule will have some buffer built in. This is called a float or slack, and it's the amount of time, potentially in days, that you can delay the activity completion before it starts to cause the delay in the tasks that follow it and potentially the entire project. So you build these float or slack in ahead of time so that when it comes to it, and you need an extra day to finish that analysis, and if the task has a couple of days of float, it's okay, because the next task that depends on that analysis doesn't start for a couple more days. Um, Critical path activities have very low or no float built in, and that's one of the reasons that they're critical. So with enough delays to these activities, you're looking at extending your project timeline, and you'd like to avoid that. A Gantt chart that I mentioned earlier is a graphical output from your scheduling software that displays that minimum amount of time that you need to complete all the tasks on the project. So again, your scheduling software creates this. And if you look at the slide, the one on the left is from the P6 software, and then the one on the right is a template that you can get in Microsoft Excel. So what does this contain as far as information? Usually on the left side of the Gantt chart, you'll see all sorts of information about the task. Who's going to do it, how many days of float it has, when it has to start, and when it ends. And one of the columns of information is generally your percentage complete. How far along are you to have that particular task completed? And so this is where you kind of keep track of the progress of that activity. And again, this will come up later in the discussion when we're talking about cost. On your horizontal axis is your time frame during which the activity will take place. So you'll probably see, days, weeks, months, years. Because each row represents a unique activity or task, you can then see how they stack up relative to each other on the timeline. The colors of the bars also have significance, and you can choose whichever colors you want. Usually your critical path tasks are in red. Then you might have your completed activities in blue, and then open or ongoing activities in green. So as I mentioned, finishing a project on time is important for many reasons, and delays can have all sorts of negative impact. But at the same time, sticking to a schedule isn't the only important thing. And we clearly saw that with the Challenger example. You never want to ignore safety or quality, especially in an industry like ours, because that can lead to the kind of issues that we saw with the Challenger. Christine, do you use a WBS in your personal projects?
I actually do. It may not be a traditional WBS, but I definitely work to have an accurate schedule because it's very important for personal projects. So let's loop back into the examples that I've been talking about over the course of the presentation. So first, let's talk about vacation planning. When you not think a WBS or a schedule, even a simple one, may not be needed, it's actually the best way to ensure everything will go as planned. So, for instance, on our family trip, we decided we wanted to go see a Major League Baseball game, which means that we needed to purchase the tickets timely to get the best price and the best seats. And then once those were purchased, we also had to think about what else comes along with that, such as parking, did we want to do scoreboard birthday messages, etc. So a lot of that we needed to make sure we were on time doing that, but we also had deadlines as the stadium that we were going to had requirements for when scoreboard messages needed to be there. We also had to think about parking on the day of the game. And I say that because I use my operating experience from attending games previously to remember that in order to not have to walk for miles from the car to the entrance, especially with a 3-year-old, isn't always the funnest environment. So we made sure to reserve a spot ahead of time, closer to the field, because that was imperative to us. And as we were doing that, they needed the vehicle information for the rental car, which I didn't have yet because we wouldn't get that information until the day we got the rental. So I ended up putting another entry on my calendar to make sure that I went back into our parking spot reservation to add that information in before we went to park. So in this case, the WBS is always a great tool for planning anything as it lays out how your activities are related and in what order they need to be done. I couldn't get the scoreboard message done before I bought the tickets because I needed to know exactly what game I was going to. And in turn, it was easy to turn it into a schedule to make sure that you knew and others knew when due dates are so they can be timely and organized in completing your tasks. In wedding planning, a schedule is very imperative as you're coordinating so many items and dealing with so many different vendors. One of the biggest lessons that I learned about is that most vendors want final payment a minimum of 2 to 3 days prior to the event. Sometimes a week, so I make that part of my schedule. In one particular wedding, the bride was adamant that the payment for the cake was not due until the day of or the day after the wedding, so she kept putting it off until the day before the wedding, when the vendor basically stated that the cake would be canceled if the remaining fee was not paid by close of business. This goes to show you how important it is to document the timelines through the WBS or through a schedule. The one area that may seem silly to even have a timeline for is walking down the aisle. And I say this because it's very important evolution in a wedding. And so the timing is crucial. So I had one bride, she chose a very unique song and had specific times when she wanted her attendants to walk down the aisle, her flower girl to walk down the aisle, and for her to walk down the aisle. It took a lot of time listening and practicing to get the timeline down to a T. Let's just say my stopwatch and my schedule were my most important tools on that wedding day. Let's turn it back over to Julie to talk about estimating.
Thanks, Christine. Actually, that was a really great example because it gives you a really accurate sense of how much detail does actually go into the schedule. Every single thing that you need to do is potentially its own task. So thanks, Christine, for sharing that. That was a really good example. Okay, so let's jump into estimating. Estimating is another really important piece of project planning because you obviously need to have the right amount of money before you can get started on any project. Your initial estimate will most likely be what we call an order of magnitude estimate, which is sort of a ballpark estimate with an accuracy of about plus or minus 50 to 75%. So when it comes to money, people don't like large uncertainties. So most of us wouldn't commit to a project based on such a loose estimate. Where I think we're more comfortable around maybe a plus or minus 10% accuracy. And this then kind of allows us to set aside that extra 10% for some extra contingency money should we need it during the project. This is essentially how projects are planned as well. There are various ways to estimate projects, and you're most likely using one of these when you're figuring out how much money you need for your personal projects too. Expert judgment is when you consult with experts who have the experience with the type of work that you're doing and base your estimate on their knowledge. So when you're having a house built, clearly you're relying on your builder to give you an accurate cost so you can financially plan for that. Analogous or top-down estimating is where you base your estimates on another really similar project. And this is called top-down because you start from a total cost that you already know, and then you kind of refine it from there, putting in your customizations and evaluating how your particular project might be different from the one that you're using. Then parametric estimating relies on historical data from many other projects that were similar, and it breaks down the total cost of those other projects into some kind of a measured unit, like a per square footage cost for a construction, for example. If you think about it this way, you can probably build a house in your town, maybe for $200 per square foot. But if in the Hamptons, it'll probably be more like $2,000 per square foot based on all the other projects that have provided their data into your calculation. So yeah, I'm just making those numbers up. It probably costs more. But that's basically what we call parametric estimating. Then there's bottom-up estimating, which is what I was talking about when you're creating your WBS. Here you start with estimating your individual tasks, and then you eventually roll up their costs until you get to the total project cost. And then 3-point estimating is kind of when you develop a best and worst case scenario and then figure out where your average is. In this case, you want to use the standard distribution on a probability curve to decide how much assurance you're comfortable with when you're picking one or the other estimate. So, for example, using the average of your best and worst case scenario gives you about a 50-50 chance that you can execute your project successfully. Those are not great odds. And I personally wouldn't go with that kind of assurance. You probably want to end up at about an 85% of your between your higher and your average estimate. That should give you a fair amount of assurance that you'll be successful. Okay, so I think at this point, I'd like to check in to see if anyone has entered any questions into the chat. Emily, is there anything there where we might want to pause?
Yeah, actually, a really good question from Taylor. Would every project manager be qualified by a specific set of certifications to obtain the title, or does the employer define what a project manager is?
That's a really good question. So project managers, I would say most employers who have project managers would prefer or might even require that the person be PMP certified. So that's the project management certification. However, it's not always a requirement as when you start out. So you may take a project management job, and then your company should give you some leeway to say, okay, well, let's get started on getting you into the position and doing some of the work, but we'll give you, let's say, 12 months or 18 months before you actually get your certification. And that's entirely reasonable. There are a lot of great project managers who have done many, many successful projects, and maybe they're not even actually certified. It's more about the experience that you get and the learning that you go through as you get more and more projects under your belt. But again, it's probably generally required that at some point in that position you become certified. But again, it's not an absolute necessity at the get-go. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I think that also it really kind of depends on, are you wanting the title? Because if you want to be a title of a project manager, a PMP project manager, then you do have to go through the certifications to obtain that. But if you just want to be a project manager, I'm sure there's lots of companies out there that don't require that PMP certification.
So
Yeah,
I will.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'll chime in a little bit. So where I work, we have different levels of projects. We have like a growth chart. So you start out like as a project coordinator where you don't need your PMP. You don't need your PMP until you're a project manager 2 or a senior project manager. So you have the graduated approach to be able to be um, within project management and still be learning, with eventually the goal of getting your PMP, because the higher you go in most organizations that I'm aware of from the companies that I've worked at, once you hit a certain level, those PMPs are required um, for you so that they have that certification. So I hope that
So
kind of helps.
So those levels could be different just depending on where it is you're working and what type of work it is you're doing. There's not like a specific timeline for you to go and get that. I do know that PMP or PMI requires 36 months of documented project management experience before you get to sit for the PMP exam, but otherwise it wouldn't be required.
Yeah, and actually, Christine, you brought a really great point. There are other steps you can take before you become the project manager. Myself, for example, I had a background in finance. So I came into project management basically being a project financial analyst. And once you get any kind of an experience watching projects sort of happen from an inside view, that really sets you up for being a project manager. And that's basically what happened with me as well. Again, you can also be a scheduler. You can start out as a scheduler and find that you have the motivation to actually be a project manager. There's also associate project managers or assistant project managers. So there's generally a really good, easy path to come into the profession. And then also a lot of people are essentially project managers. They just don't have the job title. So if in your position, you're constantly finding yourself, managing things and developing new processes and leading people to really do anything, you are basically functioning as a project manager. And then, once you can add some of the knowledge of how to use the tools and what are the specific documentation requirements, for example, that I'm talking through here, it's really an easy path into project management. So I would encourage anyone that knows how to work with people and can get people to do the right work and keep them focused and have some leadership skills to make sure that you keep control of your team, but also make a good environment for folks to work, on that team. If you have any of those skills, I highly encourage you to get into project management. I hope that helps. Any other questions, Emily, that you're seeing?
Nothing at this time.
Okay, great. All right, so let me continue to move forward, and now we're getting to what I think it was Susan that may have asked the question about monitoring and controlling and where that sort of falls in the life cycle. So again, monitoring and controlling is another step in the life cycle. However, it does take place during project execution. It simply means that you track specific data and you're comparing it to your baseline plans to make sure that things are progressing as they're supposed to, and you report out on that progress. If you see things that are not on track, then again, you use your change management process to kind of course correct and then get back on track. Sometimes an approved change to your baseline budget or schedule is significant enough that you just can't continue to use your original baselines because it just doesn't make sense to track your progress to something that's no longer the expectation. So, and doing so wouldn't give you really an accurate picture of where you are. So this is when you can get approval to re-baseline your project, to set a new baseline to which you're comparing your performance going forward. I also mentioned the concept of tracking earned value. And let me get into that a little bit because I think it's really important to understand. Simply comparing how much money the project spent to the baseline budget doesn't really give you a clear picture of how the project is doing. You can be spending money and not getting any of the work done. You need an additional parameter, some more information to judge where you are than just looking at how your project is doing with actual costs compared to the cash flows. This is where documenting the progress for your major tasks in your schedule becomes really important. The earned value formula basically compares, and I'm not going to bore you by going into the formula. I don't think anyone enjoys looking at mathematical formulas, but it basically compares how much work you completed against how much work you budgeted. how much work you budgeted for up to the point that you're at. So let me clarify that a little bit better. If you look at this chart, so this shows that as of September, your budget was $1 million. So basically, you should have done about $1 million worth of work. However, according to this line, you only actually spent $600,000. So, wow, that's great, right? You saved $400,000. Well, is that really true? Or did you just not do $400,000 worth of work? Based on what you reported as the percentage of the work that you actually completed in your schedule, your earned value is only $500,000. So what this is telling you is that you only did $500,000 worth of work, but somehow managed to spend $600,000. So this is where, you can do some additional cost and schedule analysis, and it'll probably confirm that you are not only behind schedule, but you're probably also over budget. So does that make sense? Or does anyone have any questions or comments on that?
No questions or comments. I think it makes sense.
Okay, great. All right, so let's move on. So you probably noticed that so far we spent a lot of time talking about project planning, but I can tell you that there's only a couple of slides left to discuss project execution, even though that's generally the longest leg of the project lifecycle. This is because if you did a really good job at planning, by the time you get to implementation, all the team has to do is follow the plan. This is where you really use your leadership skills from the very beginning of the project until the very end. And you need the entire team to get to the finish line. And you want to do that really without casualties. Really complex projects can be difficult to execute, and they can be really stressful. So it's incredibly important to have a healthy team dynamic. Otherwise, people get burnt out, lose their motivation, and just give up. Well, we don't want that. You don't want that for the project, but you really don't want that for the people that are involved. So you kind of have to recognize that most people do their best work when they feel respected and they understand the value of their contribution. So how do you get your team to that place? Many of you are probably familiar with Tuckman's stages of group development. You've probably seen this through leadership training, and for a few years ago, it was everywhere. Bruce Tuckman was an American psychological researcher who studied group dynamics, and he formulated this theory in 1965. According to the theory, newly formed teams go through stages before they can function at optimal levels. The first stage of this team development is forming. This is the first time the team members get together and they don't know what to expect. In your position as the leader, you need to give them the big picture so that they can align to the overall purpose of the project. At this stage, people may, still challenge your authority. So you kind of have to build trust by establishing clear expectations. The next stage is called storming. As people start working out their relationships to you and to each other, there may be a lot of disagreement, a lot of storm, and it'll be difficult to make decisions as a team because, frankly, people will kind of struggle for power. So you, as the team leader, have to provide that psychological safety for people to ask questions, to disagree in a healthy way, and make sure that everyone's voice is being heard. Once you get through this, your team will get to the next stage, which is norming. Now, everyone understands the common goal and folks are ready to work together as a team. You can now start really challenging people to learn and stretch a little bit in their functions, and then also start recognizing when they do that and start celebrating the small successes. Then once you get past norming, your team is now performing without constant help from you. By the time you get into implementation, you definitely need to be here. You're now more of a coach that helps facilitate collective decision making, and you're really getting into a place where you're recognizing good work on a regular basis to motivate people and keep them interested, and so that you can complete the project. And at the end of the project, before you end your working relationship as a team and before everyone heads back to their daily work and their own bosses, you need to make sure that you celebrate the success of the project and the team's accomplishments. And you'll do a couple of other things that are really, really important here. So let's talk about project closeout, which is your last phase. So now your project work is complete and it's finally time to wrap things up and close everything out, like your vendor invoices and contracts and your project charging codes and things like that. One of the really important things you'll do in this stage is collect your lessons learned during the project. Even if your project went off without a hitch, which almost never happens, there are always things that could have been done better, that could have gone easier, choices you could have made. So you really need to take the time to go over all of these examples with your team and discuss what went well and why, and what didn't go well and why, and how should it have gone. And you want to document this so that this experience isn't lost. Because as you know, once people, go their separate ways, everyone forgets about things. But this is really important, especially for learning organizations, especially in an industry like ours in nuclear. There will be other projects similar to yours, and they'll be able to plan better if they know what pitfalls and challenges they should avoid based on other people's experience. So Christine, what of these closeout steps do you perform, like for a wedding, for example?
So for the wedding, there's a lot of things to consider before I can close it out. I need to make sure all the vendors are paid, the rentals are returned. So I usually have a checklist that I make to make sure that everything's taken care of. Any ancillary duties are all squared away. And then, of course, if you're being compensated for coordinating or planning the wedding, is to collect that payment. But I also take the opportunity to ask for feedback, not only from the bride and groom, but also from those involved, especially the parents, to see what feedback that they have so that I can use that for future operating experience and lessons learned, to be able to use that for the future. And I even do that for smaller projects in a family vacation. We sat down and we made sure that we met our objectives, and the main thing there was, did we make core memories? And then, of course, we went over our budget. Did we go over budget? Did we stay on budget? And in our family trip, we went over budget. We spent a little bit more than we planned on to, but had we not spent that, we would have been able to save that for the next family vacation. So really, you need a checklist is really good when you're closing out a project. And I'm going to turn it back over to Julie really quick so we can kind of get things wrapped up with our limited time amount.
Okay, thanks, Christine. So it looks like, I believe we only have a couple of minutes left, but I do want to address quickly one of the questions that again came from Susan. Susan, thank you so much for asking these questions. She asked, can I provide some examples of how to monitor team health and how you've helped issues that we've experienced regarding monitoring team health? So today, in this day and age, we have technology, right? I'm speaking to you guys from hundreds of miles away potentially. So we do a lot of things over Teams and things like that. But when you're to monitor team health, there needs to be obviously a lot of communication, and you really need to sometimes just be there with the folks to see how people are feeling, see how the discussions go. So in a recent project that we completed, again, we had a huge project team. Some of the folks were in the Philippines, all over the world, all over the country. So we did a lot of the project work over the phone. But we made sure that we got together on a regular basis to whatever extent it was possible to actually be in the same room with each other and see how each other feels. Kind of look at who's looking ragged, who's looking stressed out. And you really can't experience those things if you're only ever working with folks over the phone. So it's important to build into your plan and your budget how you're going to be together with some of the folks, at certain times, to be able to have personal face-to-face conversations, to see how everyone's doing. If you have to make major decisions, sit down with folks and have a face-to-face conversation. I think it just makes it a lot easier to see what people are really trying to say, what you're trying to hear. And getting together, through a project like that, just going out to dinner, having some common meetings once in a while will really, really help you with that. I think you'll find human beings, we're all human beings on these projects, right? And even when there's kind of consternation and people aren't getting along, it's a lot easier to bring folks together if they have an opportunity to look each other in the face, have a dinner, have a couple of drinks, and just talk really as human beings, not just professionals that are here to do a task. So I think it's just easier to control people's emotions and to really feel the temperature of the team that way. So I don't know, Susan, if that really answers your question, but developing personal relationships with people on your project so you know how they're feeling, you know how they're being affected, to know where they want to go. They won't always agree, but let people have a voice, let people have that opportunity to look each other in the face and say, this is a great idea, or no, I think we should do it differently. I think that's probably maintaining that personal connection as you work with all these other human beings is probably one of the most important things that you do as a project manager.
So I'll chime in really quick. Another thing is if you would like to get an outside perspective, invite people outside of your team to come into your meetings and do observations because they're going to give you real honest feedback from those observations. That's one thing I've seen happen here at Energy Northwest of getting people outside your department to come into your project meetings and observing and then giving you the feedback of how your team really is doing.
Thank you, Julie and Christine. This was great. I loved it. I'm now going to turn over the time to Price so he can close us out. Thank you.
Hey there, Emily, would you give me a quick check that you can see and hear me?
Yes, sir.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for joining us on the fantastic webinar today. I found it really interesting and got to learn a lot today as well as during a lot of the prep work. I want to give a shout out, especially to Emily for being a fantastic facilitator, keeping an eye on the chat, as well as our wonderful co-hosts of this, Christine and Julie, and then a special shout out to Caitlin for helping us out with some of the back end stuff, getting registration out and things like that. Up next on the PD docket is going to be Professional Development Week 2024. That will be the week of November 11th this year. Like previous years, we will have PD Library spotlights on Monday and Friday, and then we will have live webinars Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of that week. We are working very diligently on all of that, so please keep an eye out on the different social media sites for WIN, on the WIN website, and via email blast as well from Communications Committee. So with that, I will close us for the fantastic webinar today and hope everybody has a great day. Take care.